I am thrilled to be able to share a little information with you. As Drew said, my name is Kirti Matura. I am a horticulturist and botanist. I have loved working with plants basically all my life. I grew up in Michigan, gardening from a very young age with my mother. And as I transitioned to Montana and finally Arizona, that passion of plants continued on. And when I moved to Arizona, I thought, hey, I'm going to get a vegetable garden going. It was a disaster. So I very quickly realized that I had no idea what I was doing, that vegetable gardening here in the Sonoran Desert is totally different than vegetable gardening in Michigan or basically any place else in the country. So with that said, what I would like to do this evening is share a little bit of information with you that I think would be considered the basics to get you going and be successful with some vegetable gardening here in the low desert. First off, you really have to focus on your soil preparation. When I moved here, somebody was talking about soil and I, kind of, lifted up one foot and looked under it and thought, what soil? Growing up in Michigan, soil was really dark. You could scoop it up. It had this earthy aroma. Not the case here in the desert. So we really have to focus on preparing our soil. We can't just take it for granted. There are some native vegetables that would just thrive with no soil preparation. But overall, for most of the plants that you'd be interested in growing, those traditional vegetable crops, you're going to want to really pump up the organic matter. Now, this is an example of our three basic textures or grouped categories of soil. We have clay, sand, and loam. Clay is a soil that is composed primarily of super fine particles. Basically, you can't even see individual particles without a microscope. It is a challenge in that it can easily get compacted and it is difficult for water to percolate through that soil. The aeration within the soil is also a challenge. We have to remember all the needs of our plants, and especially the needs of the root system of our plants. The root systems need air in the soil to be able to carry on the process of respiration. So that's a feature that especially non-desert natives can really struggle with. The opposite extreme would be a sandy soil, mainly comprised of large particles, usually very coarse in their shape and form. And this, as I say, is the opposite of a clay soil. Big particles will then mean you have large spaces between those individual particles. So you have fantastic aeration. Water can move through that sandy soil very easily. In fact, too rapidly for most of our plants to be able to absorb appreciable amounts of water. And it's not much of a substrate for nutrients to cling on to be available for root absorption at any time. Now, the Goldilocks, the in-between soil, would be a loam. That is a soil that really is comprised of a range of particles, from the very fine clay particles to the larger coarse sand particles, everything in between. So it's a good balance, and it's an ideal soil type for growing most anything. But even if you were fortunate to have a loamy soil, you still are lacking the organic matter. When I look at the soil here, and that made me wonder, where's the soil? It's very pale, tan in color. That is because there isn't much organic matter. Generally, we have about 1% organic matter in our desert soils. compared to maybe even up to 5% in those really rich soils of other regions, other areas. So for most of our vegetables, we have to spend a good amount of time adding in organic matter. And it doesn't matter if you're starting out with clay soil, sandy soil, or the more luxurious loamy soil, we've got to add the organic matter. In addition to being so low in organic matter, our desert soils, because of our climate, the aridity that we have here, especially impacting the pH of the soil, this is another challenge. When we talk about the pH, that scale runs from 0 to 14, with 7 being neutral. In Michigan, we had more acidic soil. That is ideal for a big range of vegetables, from slightly acidic to about neutral. pH is ideal for a lot of our vegetable plants to grow and thrive. In our desert, we have soils that are most likely in the valley. I'd say you're going to have a pH that's at least 7.5, perhaps even around 8. Some places really extreme, even higher. Now remember, this is an exponential scale. So every increment from 7 to 8 and so forth is a huge jump, huge magnification. So with our alkaline soils, the high pH, we can see that there are nutrients that are necessary for plant growth and development that can be a really big challenge. These nutrients, such as nitrogen, we have nitrogen in our desert soils, but due to the chemistry of our soils, a lot of this, and the phosphorus and iron, manganese, zinc, especially also, they're locked up. They're bound in chemical configurations that don't allow the roots of our plants to easily just absorb them and take them up through the system of the plant. Pardon me. Now, with the low organic content and the high pH of our soils, we want to focus on compost, organic matter added into your soil. If you are starting out with real extreme conditions, it might even be better and easier to rise above and garden in raised beds. So this is something you might want to consider. There are areas of the valley that have a lot of caliche in the soil, and if you've ever been digging in your soil and hit a cement-like material, that was caliche. So it looks very similar to cement, and when the shovel hits it, it definitely feels like cement. When a root hits it, or when water hits that caliche, it is just like cement also. It's impenetrable. So if you have extreme caliche, there's really not an easy way to battle that. So creating raised beds could be of a great benefit to you. Now, some of the areas on the outskirts of the valley, people that are living along preserves might have really rocky soil. So there again, it might be good. I'm definitely of the age where some of these raised systems are appealing to me because it's getting harder and harder to do a lot of that bending over. So different heights of beds can accommodate different physical needs as well. There are infinite materials that you could use to create your raised planters. Just think in terms of expense, longevity, and see which might be the best for you to use. And also, of course, the aesthetics of the material. A beautiful, very ornate bed built out of fancy brick. These are redwood planks or cedar planks. They're fencing slats. They have a high expense on the front end, but they can be expected to give you good life for usually at least 10 years. And especially if you can line that raised bed with some very, very thick plastic, now just the sides, not the bottom, that will actually extend the material, life of the material even more. Here are some fancy cinder blocks. This is recycled plastic. There are kits that you can configure into different shapes, everything from a square to a triangle, whatever shape you would be interested in forming. Just remember, if you are working with raised beds, you want every inch of that bed to be accessible easily. So what is your, your arm length? What's your reach? That is going to limit the width of that bed. And this bed is only accessible from one side. There's a fence along the back. So this can only be one arm length. Something like this that is freestanding, you could access it from one side, an arm length, and from the other side, an arm length also. So think about that also. Now, if you're going to be gardening in the ground, particularly if you're just starting out, compost, compost, compost. You really cannot go overboard with the amount of compost you add into our desert soil if you're just starting to grow vegetables in an area. Pardon me. The kind of rule of thumb is add about anywhere from a half or third to a half of the depth of the bed with compost. So I'd say a good 6 to 8 inches thick of compost laid over your bed would be a good starting point to enrich that desert soil. Now, ideally, work that soil to a depth of 18 inches, 1.5 feet. That would accommodate the root systems of really any of the vegetables you'd be interested in growing. Some of our vegetables only have roots that mature to a depth of about 6 inches, 8 inches, but some of our vegetables will have a root system that can go 1 foot or 1.5 feet deep. We want to make sure that the system is such that it's ready to accommodate the roots of any of our vegetables. At least have a 12-inch deep growing space in your soil. So you want to work that in. And of course, you can't, just spread out the 8 inches all at once and expect most of our garden tillers to be able to accommodate that. But you want to, add maybe a couple of inches, work that in, a couple more inches, work that in, so that you can have that organic matter worked all through the depth of that planting soil. Then after you do that, we always have to have a level surface for planting, particularly if we're planting with seeds. You don't want a slope that will tend to have our seed perhaps float downhill as it's getting watered.
Hey, Kirti.
Yes.
Is it okay if I ask you a few questions?
Yes, sure.
So the first one is, I just did a soil test with 4 types of tests, and I have a good pH balance, really low nitrogen, and normal phosphorus, and somewhat low potash. I know the nitrogen will be helped by composting, but what is potash? A cheap, sustainable fix.
Okay, good question. We haven't quite gotten to the nutrients yet, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. But yeah, whoever this question was from, those wheels are turning. Good job. So this is a new area. They laid out the design of the beds, and you can see where they have worked the soil and planted, and it's very conspicuous where the walkways are. So not only are we adding that compost in and loosening the soil, which is great for the aeration and for the ease of the root development. So that's a lot of work. So we have that light soil that's got good aeration. We don't want to walk all over it and compact it again. Even the lightest weight of you who are with us this evening, walking on that soil is going to compact it. So avoid that. Go to great lengths to avoid walking on your prepared soil. And the root systems of your plants will be very, very grateful for your conscientiousness along that line. Here are some different ways. With this example, we just had the bare soil. And especially once the plants get going, it will remain evident where the feet are supposed to be and where the plants have their space. In these examples, they've got smaller plots that are outlined with some mulch, just coarse chipped wood material. In this example, somebody had put down newspaper and then covered that with straw. By the end of the season, a lot of that is weathered. You could just work it into the soil as more organic matter. In this example, they have some old 2x4s laid down. So walking on those is going to distribute your weight and it won't be compacting the soil as it would with just 1 foot after another. Here, they've designated, made it very obvious where people are to walk, even though they don't have these stones perfectly spaced for walking on. It's evident where you should be walking. So that's very, very important that we're not walking on the soil once it's prepared. So the organic matter is of utmost importance. I guess I should back up there. It's so important. You may see references or hear of other gardeners saying, well, you've got to add these other amendments to the soil as you're preparing it. And there are some other things you can add in. You could add fertilizers as you're working that soil, especially dry fertilizer. It's easy to mix it in as you're mixing in the compost. You could add, especially for clayey soils, you could add some gypsum at the time of soil preparation, and gypsum will help keep those clay particles kind of loosened. That the gypsum, the chemistry of it works so that those fine particles of clay can adhere and create little tiny micro clumps, which will make openings in the soil. But gypsum isn't a permanent fix to a heavy clay soil. You have to keep adding it over time. For the pH adjustment, you might use sulfur, soil sulfur. Well, that can help buffer that pH, lower it a little bit closer to a neutral pH of 7, but it's not permanent either. You have to keep adding that. The organic matter that you work into the soil, over time, it will do the same job that the gypsum and sulfur will. Any of those additives to the soil are not permanent. In the soil, we have to keep adding them. But my suggestion is really make sure you focus on the compost, the organic matter. And as the seasons change, you're going to want to add maybe another inch or 2 of compost. Spread it out over your bed before you plant for the season and work that in again. Now, you don't need to go 18 inches deep. You might have heard some people use the practice of no-till. I really suggest if you're just starting out that it can be very beneficial to loosen that soil, till it, work that soil and mix the organic matter down to 18 inches, but you don't need to do that all the time. That preliminary preparation and then just adding some to the top few inches of the soil, lightly mixing that in, will keep the organic content of the soil at a good level. So you do have to work on it. It's going to be something that every season you're going to want to address. And we do have 2 main growing seasons here in the valley, our cool season and warm season. So as you're changing over, that's a good time to address the conditions of your soil. Now, you could also use liquid fertilizer, mixing that in, spraying it in or whatever, as you're amending the soil before planting. That could work as well. So those are just some things you might consider adding in addition to the compost, but I'd say the critical thing is adding that compost, the organic matter, to the soil.
Chrissy, I got a couple of questions about composting and the mulching. One is with regards to compost, I have seen cow, chicken, and worm. What would be best to use in a raised bed garden?
So if I'm understanding, you're asking about the manures and those. Yeah, if you're going to add those directly to the soil, you need to do that ideally a couple of months before you plan to plant. Work that in, keep some moisture in the soil so that the microorganisms can start to break those materials down, those manures down, so that they're not burning the plant roots, and they're adding the benefits of the organic matter to the soil. I think most ideally is to add those manures to your compost system. And then once it's decomposed, adding that into your vegetable garden.
Thank you. And then another one was regarding mulching. Is it recommended to mulch directly at the base of the vegetable plants or leave that soil exposed?
You always want to leave a few inches around the stem of your plants. Don't put the organic mulch right up to the stem. That could allow for moisture to linger, and then the possibility of fungus or even a bacterial decay to set in. So great question. You want to leave a little airspace around the stem of the plant.
And then, I'm sorry, I have a spruce tree in my gardening area. I've cut the lower branches off. Should I take out it completely, including the trunk and all the roots?
Is this, you mean where you want to plant your vegetables?
I believe, yeah, it looks like the spruce tree is in the gardening area.
Okay. Now, when we have trees close to a vegetable garden area or a compost system, definitely, mature tree roots near those can really cause a problem for your activity. Definitely, it causes a problem for the tree. With our vegetable gardening and definitely with our composting, we tend to keep the soil pretty consistently moist. That is not good for our desert trees. We need to have a period of some, drying out before we add more water again for our desert plants. Now, a lot of the root systems of mature trees are, they're so dense. And, if they're well developed, it's going to be difficult for other plants to get their roots growing down properly. So I would say it would be to be having a really dynamite vegetable garden. I'd say you'd want to assess that. And if it isn't a critical tree in the landscape, I'd say maybe it would be better to remove that and have, some trees further out away from the vegetable garden.
Thank you.
Sure. Your next critical thing would be the watering. Water, water, water. Boy, do we know that after this summer. Now, with your soil texture, the type of the soil that you have in your landscape, you will have the wetting pattern or the movement of water will be different with the different soil types. With our heavy clay soil comprised of those superfine particles, if we were to take 1 gallon of water and add it by drip, 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 that wetting pattern will generally be wide spreading, but not very deep from 1 gallon of water. Okay? With a sandy soil, the wetting pattern will be very deep, but not very wide. That water just shoots right down through those openings between the soil particles, moves very rapidly, moves very low. With the loamy soil, the Goldilocks of the soils, the water is going to move about as deep as it does spread wide. Okay, so this is kind of good for people like me. You can be envisioning how your water is moving through the soil. So that will help you in your watering practices. If you've really amended your clayey soil or your sandy soil or your loamy soil with loads of compost, your wetting pattern will be typically similar to a loamy soil, about as deep as it is wide. So that should help you in determining, especially if you're using drip, what spacing do you need for your emitters? Or out in the landscape, this means that you will have to water longer to get that water to go deep enough for your tree roots. But since that water is going to remain in that soil for a long time, you don't have to water as often. With a sandy soil out in your landscape, you're going to have a gazillion emitters around your big mature tree. But you won't have to water very long, because that small amount of water that you apply is going to go nice and deep for those tree roots. So you'd adjust the number and placement of emitters based on the type of soil you have. And also your watering frequency is affected by this. But for our vegetable gardens, we've basically got this nice even wetting pattern that we can think of. My recommendation is always watering at ground level. I do know of incredible vegetable gardens that only get watered with sprinklers. That's it, all the time. But there can be challenges. I am one of the laziest gardeners on earth, so I am always trying to avoid challenges. And I think if the majority of your watering is done at ground level for your vegetable garden, it can minimize these challenges that might potentially occur otherwise. With our water from Chandler, any of our municipal water sources are real high in salts. We have a lot of minerals in our soils. And, what's that builds up on our, shower walls or shower doors? It's the minerals. And think about it. When we use a sprinkler and that water hits a leaf, that the excess water droplets will evaporate into the air, but the minerals, they're too heavy, they don't go with it. Over time, you can have such an accumulation of salts that it can cause some burning of the leaf tissue. I don't have a good visual that's real easy to see that concept of the minerals building up, so I just use this beautiful watermelon. Well, we can see all those minerals that have accumulated from the sprinklers hitting that plant material. So that's one reason I think really to try to more consistently water at ground level. I am not saying don't ever spray your plants down. Hosing your plants off periodically at different times of the year especially can be one of the best pest management approaches. So I'm not saying don't get your foliage wet, but overall I think watering at ground level is the safest. There are numerous ways you can approach that. You could just use a hose and let water flow. In this garden, we have these berms, these raised soil masses, perimeters to individual beds that you see here. They have the hose running, so they turn on the hose, let it run for a while, and you have a couple of inches of water applied, the hose is turned off, and that water can just slowly, trickle in, percolate through the soil. You always want to use some kind of a breaker to soften the flow. You don't want to turn the water on and you have a shoot out that's going to, move soil and perhaps uproot some small plants. It would definitely wash away little seed that was just planted. But this can be a nice way to really address having plants with different watering schedules. if you're growing tepary beans that are native to the Southwest, they need very infrequent watering compared to a tomato or a basil plant. Having a system like this gives you a lot of flexibility to control how often you're watering different types of plants. You could fill this bed with plants that needed more frequent watering, this one with plants that needed less frequent, and so forth. You can see they've watered this bed, so the soil that's moistened is very dark in color. That is dry with this raised berm around here. You can see it's dry, it's lighter in color. But critical thing for your vegetable garden, you have to have an easily accessible and consistent source of water. These are some other systems that you might think about. Laser tubing. This is tubing that the manufacturer drills these little pinpoint openings into the tubing at set intervals. This is the 1/4-inch tubing. A lot of us, we call it spaghetti tubing. And you can coil it around to get good moisture coverage or snake it back and forth. This might be really good if you've got a heavy planting through an area. A similar water approach would be a soaker hose. Soaker hose is super porous. There is 1/4-inch, but a lot of times you see it in the 1/2-inch that looks almost like a regular garden hose, but it's leaky. So all these pores allow water to just slowly seep out and soak into the soil. The challenge with the laser tubing and soaker hose is that with the minerals in our water, it could clog those pores pretty rapidly, and that might cause problems. I don't like these, but I do know of people. I have a friend, she uses nothing but soaker hoses to water her garden. So the thing is, experiment a little bit, maybe talk to some friends who have been gardening and figure out what's going to work for you. If it's going to work for you, it's going to work for your plants. Some other options, we have micro bubblers that are adjustable. Maybe a particular time of the year you don't have any plants. You could close this off and have great water savings, and you can open it up to different adjustments. 1/2 gallon an hour, 1 gallon an hour, 2 gallons an hour, and you can see the flow here can be pretty wide or it can be very narrow. This is a multi-head port where you can attach spaghetti hoses to 8 little ports, little openings, connectors here, and send them off in different directions to give water through an area. So just some different approaches. And here we have inline emitters. The manufacturer places emitters in this 1/2-inch poly tube. They might be set at 1-foot intervals, 2-foot intervals, 6-inch, whatever. And they're designed to decrease the work we have to do. We don't have to go through and insert individual emitters. It's done for us. This, you can see the little wedding patterns here. This can be an easy system for some of your projects, perhaps. And you can run it the length of the bed or across the width of the bed, all kinds of configurations. Just make sure that any of your emitters that you're using, that they are pressure compensating. This gives you consistent watering from the very start of your tubing to the very, very end. Even if it's 100 feet down the line, you will have consistent watering. If it's not pressure compensating, you'll have heavier flow towards the source of your water, and it will gradually get to be a lighter flow trickling off. So the plants at the tail end are going to miss out. They won't get as much water. And this is the spaghetti 1/4-inch tubing with the inline emitters. And again, these are pressure compensating, and you can even see the little, drip, drip, drip coming down, applied gradually so that it can soak in very easily into the soil. Some people like to hand water. And if that's the case, make sure you have a very gentle flow. I get furious when I see people blasting the soil. You might as well be walking all over it, because if you're using a hard pressure of water, it's going to compact that soil. And again, decrease the aeration, decrease the ease that the roots have to grow and the amount of air that they have available to carry on respiration. Always make sure you have it set on a light shower or rain setting to minimize the impact, and also make sure you're careful in adjusting the flow of water from your spigot. Just because you have it on a shower setting, if you've got your spigot open all the way, that could be, 80 pounds of pressure coming through from the city, and it's still going to have an impact on the soil. So you want to turn your spigot on, and just when you have the perfect flow, stop. Don't open the spigot any further. I'm a real stickler about this. You can ask any of the volunteers who used to work with me. I was always going around behind them, sneaking up and turning the water pressure down. Well, how do you know if you watered enough? Especially when you're hand watering or with your irrigation system. You're going to have to go through a period of time adjusting, knowing how long you need to water to get the water to go deep enough. For your vegetables, a lot of them, it might suffice to have just one of those long screwdrivers. But I think everybody needs a soil probe that is generally 3 feet long. My gardening friend, she got fancy and painted at the 1 foot intervals, different colors. So it's very easy to see. The concept is you water, and then about 20 or 30 minutes after you finish watering, go out with your soil probe and stick it into the soil in a few different areas. I say a few because you don't want to be fooled by a rock and think, oh, it didn't go very deep, and turn the water on more. No. But the idea is when you're pushing this probe through moist soil, it will be easy moving. When you hit dry soil, you will know it. It's going to be so much more difficult, so much more effort is needed to push that probe any deeper into the soil. So it's a no-brainer. You will know when you've hit dry soil. When you pull your probe back out, you eyeball where it stopped. Pull it back out, and then from the bottom up to that point, you can measure how deep that water went. Do you need to water longer so that it goes deeper? Or did it go up to the handle for your vegetable garden? You don't need to be applying water 3 feet deep for your vegetables, and that's a serious waste of water, and we wouldn't want Drew to know about that. So that can really help you decide how long you need to water. But when you're hand watering, even though it's a gentle flow, it's a lot of watering coming very fast. So I always recommend, go through and water your entire area that needs it, and then maybe wait 5 or 10 minutes, come back and start all over again. And by doing that a few times, at least, I'd say usually at least 3 times, that makes sure that you're getting enough water applied that'll go deep enough. So your water is going to need to be adjusted. Definitely if we get a good rain. For our vegetable garden, if we get half an inch of rain, whoa, hold off at least one round of watering, one scheduled watering, because that is great water. It's done its job. We want to let it benefit the plants. So once the soil starts to dry out again, then you can continue with your watering schedule. But I think everybody needs a rain gauge.
Hey, Kirti, quick question regarding the soaker hoses.
Sure.
Do they make pressure compensated laser tubing? I'm guessing the pressure. Do they make pressure compensated, like I guess soaker hoses? Or
as far as I know, neither laser tubing nor soaker hoses. I'm not aware of any systems that have any pressure compensating. That would be very difficult because you don't know how long that hose is going to run. So even if you were putting some kind of an adapter, it's still going to make it really impossible to know exactly what the flow is. So
I wasn't aware of any, so I thought I'd ask.
yeah. The best I could recommend would be turn on your water to a very, very concise set, the spigot, have it turned on just to a perfect spot, and then let the water flow out of the laser tubing or the soaker hose, almost like you would do for a sprinkler system, kind of a catch can test. Let it run for a while, 15 minutes or so, and then that way you can kind of calculate about how much water is coming out. But there again, it's probably going to range some if you've got a real long soaker hose or real long laser tubing. It's probably going to fluctuate from the beginning of that tube to the very end of it.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so it's kind of hit or miss when we're using those systems. It's not as accurate as a drip system with pressure compensating emitters. Yeah. So when we do have one of these clocks or controllers, whatever you want to call it, they're not set them and forget them systems. You need to be adjusting that throughout the season as your plants grow and mature. And we cannot combine this with any of our desert landscape valves. You've got to spend the money that, what is it, like Drew, $80 or so for an additional valve. That will allow you to water your vegetables properly, and all of your desert landscape plants, your trees, your shrubs, your perennials get watered properly that way. And that's going to be the healthiest for your plants, and also in the long run, the water saver and budget saver. So always check for leaks. If you see, if a hose hasn't been running and you see something like this was at a community garden, but I just thought, you guys, you should be looking for some problem, because all the other beds out here, look how dry it is. Every place else. So there had been a blowout in one of the tubes. And look at this, when that system goes on, that water is just shooting out of there. This was another one. This was just a case of that fitting wasn't tightened well enough. So check your system. And this is a pond of water after just a few minutes. So always check for leaks, and also check to make sure that your system isn't clogged at all. Now, there are, we did fertilize some back in Michigan, but after we did our initial, amending the soil before planting, there wasn't a whole lot of fertilizing that was needed. And I think a lot of people think if they add a whole bunch of compost, organic matter to their soil here, I'm done. You have to get your best vegetable development, you have to still fertilize. Now, you wouldn't have to fertilize as often as if it were just the desert soil, but you're going to want to keep boosting those resources back into the soil for your vegetables. And there's a wide range. There are synthetic as well as organic fertilizers available. Just aside from the concept of gardening organically, I believe that the organic fertilizers offer another benefit with the formulation of the nitrogen in the organic fertilizers. Microorganisms have to help break it down and then make that nitrogen available gradually to the plants over time. So if you do have a nutrient deficiency with nitrogen, a synthetic, boom, you apply that, and a couple days later you see the results. It will be slower with the organic, but that nitrogen remains available in the soil for a much longer time. Synthetic nitrogen, it is very easily flushed through the soil. If we're watering every 2 or 3 days in the summer, within no time, we've washed away all the nitrogen that we put in through a synthetic fertilizer. So that is one thing that I really am, just a cheerleader for the organic fertilizers, especially because of the work of or the, the composition of the nitrogen. So on our fertilizers, these three numbers represent the amount of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. So we do have nitrogen in our soil. For a lot of our vegetable plants, we've got to boost that up. And pardon me, the potassium, pardon me, in our desert soil, generally we've got loads of potassium. So that third number, you really don't have to worry about at all. Now, the phosphorus, that is a nutrient that through its different functions, it really helps with root development of our plants and also flowering and fruit production. So, not mine, think tomatoes. Flowering tomatoes lead to tomato fruits. So it is important, and that's probably one that you have to think about more. With the organic fertilizer products, these numbers will usually be much lower than they are for synthetics. You might have a synthetic that's maybe 12, 12, 12, and you think, well, I'm getting a lot more for my money. Well, during the summer, watering your vegetables every 2 or 3 days, that 12% nitrogen is going to be 0% nitrogen in no time, whereas this 3% nitrogen in the organic product is going to be just very slowly decreasing. So all around, I just think that organics are really overall great, but definitely I think for our vegetable gardens, the way to go. Now, either way, if you're using dry, you will have instructions on the packaging that will usually tell you how much per square footage to apply. And you want to have the soil lightly moistened before applying your fertilizer. Measure it out and then apply it to the soil and gently work it into the soil, like the top inch or so, especially the phosphorus. Phosphorus doesn't move very easily through the soil, so you want to get it down at least a little ways. And then after fertilizing, water your plants in, water that soil. For liquid, it's usually concentrated. The label will tell you how to dilute it, whether it's a tablespoon per gallon or whatever. So I do recommend that you follow those guidelines that they have on the packaging with your fertilizing products. During frequency of fertilizing, that will depend really on the season and what you're growing. The first number, the nitrogen, that really addresses vegetative growth above ground. So we're getting into the cool season now. We're growing a lot of leafy vegetables, our lettuce, our chard, things like that. So we really want to focus on vegetative growth. So nitrogen is going to be a great thing to make sure that that's sufficient in the soil for the cool season. If we're thinking during the warm season, tomatoes, peppers, things like that, we don't want to just all through the season be pumping nitrogen in thinking foliage, 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 because that could be at the expense of the flowers and then the fruit production. So just depending on what you're growing, the time of year, you might be fertilizing about every 2 or 3 weeks, and it might be much less often, depending, as I say, on the types of things you're growing and the season. So for
real quick question about fertilizing. Yes. Would you recommend adding magnesium sulfate to our soil regularly?
No, I wouldn't go too gung-ho with that. I would, maybe more so for, I think, lazy gardener. I love those general all-purpose fertilizers. In fact, my favorite this is really the only thing I've used since I met this product, golly, 15 years ago or so. I use it for anything and everything, potted plants, indoor plants. It stinks. It smells worse than fish emulsion, but it's processed differently than the fish emulsion. You have a lot of enzymes and so forth left. But anyway, with this, it's pretty much an all-purpose. You have what we call our macronutrients, and also a lot of the micronutrients. They are just as necessary for plant development, but they're needed in relatively minute amounts. So I think, a real easy way to go would be an all-purpose fertilizer, and there are all-purpose vegetable foods. You could, start getting more specific. There are fertilizers for tomatoes, fertilizer for avocados and citrus and so forth. But for most of our vegetable gardening, I don't think you would have to, I think you said magnesium sulfate. I don't think you'd really have to focus on that so much. Now, peppers, chili peppers, they love magnesium. You might, dress around the root zone of those maybe a couple times during the growing season, but overall for your vegetables, I don't think that would be necessary.
Thank you.
Oh, sure. Now for planting seeds, the great thing about getting older is you can think differently. I would grumble as a kid. And yeah, where the heck did these rocks come from? It was just, routine every spring. Mom would send me out to go through the vegetable garden after we kind of worked the soil and, pick out all the rocks. It's like, I picked out the rocks last year. Where did these rocks come from? But when I got older and I could think like a germinating seed, then I understood what an important job I had. You want to make sure that your soil is nice and smooth, no big chunks or clods of clay, no stones or rocks. We want a seed to be able to germinate and just shoot for the sky as easily as possible. We're nurturing. Those are our babies. So this is just beautiful, ideal. This soil, it's all prepared for planting some seed. Now, seed packets, every company has a little bit different presentation information, but they have spent thousands, research and development. What's the best depth to plant your seed? What's the perfect spacing? And this is a good one. How many days to expect before germination? If it says up to 25 days before that emerges, shoots up above ground, germinates, I won't start worrying at day 3. Oh my gosh, something's wrong. I don't see any little sprouts. Well, it shouldn't be sprouting until at least day 10 or even possibly day 25. So all of these companies, they've got great information. Some of it's written out. Others, they've got very easy, quick facts, little chart systems. But that's useful information for all of us, with the exception of the sun exposure. For that, we might have to be, extrapolating or, interpreting. A lot of times full sun doesn't mean full sun here in the desert. You might take advantage of expediting germination by soaking seed overnight. Just soak it in water, especially larger seed. If it's real small seed and you soak it, then it's a challenge to try to get it unclumped to spread it properly. But big seed, once that seed starts to absorb moisture, it's going to plump up. So you can see how much bigger these soaked seeds are than the original seeds. Big plump. They are ready to go. So we're going to cut germination time down by soaking the seeds in water overnight or for a day before planting. Now, spacing is important. When we are working with root vegetables, definitely spacing is super, super duper important. And if we do not space, if we don't thin, and for some of us, this is painful and you can't even make yourself do it, you're not going to get the best harvest. With root vegetables, they have to have enough room. Otherwise, how is a beet or a carrot or a radish supposed to develop? And radishes, oh my gosh, they grow so fast and they're so aggressive, they'll be like, elbowing each other out of the soil if they don't have enough space. So make sure when you have seedlings like this, you've got to do something. A lot of these are edible and very tasty. You would pay high price for these little equivalent of microgreens in a market. So take a tray or a basket out with you, and when you have to thin, just put them into that basket and sprinkle them in your salad that night. But it is important to thin. You can't get wonderful, bib lettuce like this if you don't thin. You're just not going to get good development. Too crowded. Now, planting, some things we will want to start early. You did receive a planting calendar. On those calendars, it indicates whether it's something to be direct seeded, and that would be something that you're better off planting it right where it's going to grow and mature. Other things, usually indicated with an S. Other things, you might see a T. That indicates transplant. So for our tomatoes, for example, we want to start those around late December, no later than early January, to have them growing and ready, of good size, to plant out when we have no more danger of frost. Now, usually you count back about 6 to sometimes even 8 weeks before planting to start plants indoors. So the idea is for the tomatoes, they need warm soil. If we wait till the soil warms outside in the garden, we'll never get any tomatoes because the plants can't grow fast enough before we get too darn hot for them to develop any fruit. There are so many different things you can use as containers to start your little vegetables, but just always make sure it's a clean receptacle for them to start so you're not risking disease. So here they've recycled some cups. Make sure holes are punched in the bottom for drainage. You can wash out with soap and followed by a bleach solution to recycle these little 6-packs that you might have gotten other plants in from the nursery. They'll usually go 2 or 3 rounds. There are little peat pots and just all kinds of things that you can use. But the main thing is we want to make sure that they're in a nice loose soil and they have good light and good aeration to let those seeds germinate and start growing without incurring any kind of damping off or other diseases. And always label, label, label. These are multiple types of chili peppers, basil, and tomatoes. And I couldn't tell you one basil or tomato seedling or basil seedling from another type. I have to have the labels. Now, this would be different if you're the type you want surprises and nothing but surprises in the garden. So basically,
hey,
yes.
I just want to let you know it's 7 o'clock. I just wanted to just give you a reminder.
Yeah, so we've got about 10 more minutes before our questions and end of the night. Is that it?
Yeah, about 10, 15 minutes.
Okay. So with the process of germination, a seed, it all starts with moisture. So a seed will take in moisture, and once you've exposed that to moisture, you cannot let it dry out. It will die. You cannot do mouth to mouth, CPR of any type. You've got to start with new seed. So make sure when you're ready to start, you stay consistent with the moisture. But the seed germinates, and we see the shoot above ground pop up. And initially, those are called seed leaves or cotyledons. They carry nourishment from that embryo, from the seed, to get the plant its start until it produces true leaves that will then take in the sunlight and then be able to photosynthesize to produce the plant's own food. So they're a temporary food source. So after the true leaves or the cotyledons or seed leaves, true leaves might look like a totally different plant. But this is important because when we're starting out with little seedlings, usually we need to let them grow. If we're starting in little trays like this, we're likely not going to be able to leave them in there long enough to get big enough to transplant out to the garden. So we're going to have to do, bump them up. And the best time to do that is about when the second set, this is the first set, the second set of true leaf starts to pop, then that's usually when the little seedling's strong enough. But always be very careful. Do not hold it by the stem. That stem, even with the most delicate touch, is too easy to squish. So you're going to want to handle it by the leaves very gently and transplant it from one receptacle to the next larger one. So here we've got the little true leaves here and the cotyledons of these tomatoes. These are cotyledons of basils, cotyledons of chili plants. So once our plants are big enough to transplant, go out to the garden, we need to harden them off. And that is the term used to indicate that we're going to get them used to that change from being sheltered indoors to out in the garden. It's a process that would ideally take at least a week to 2 weeks. Put them out for a couple hours in a sheltered place outside. They're going to start getting more air movement and different temperatures. Bring them back in, put them back out the next day for a little bit longer. Bring them back in until finally you've got them closer and closer and closer, practically out to where you're going to plant them. So then they're used to the sun and the air movement and so forth. And that will limit the shock at the time of transplant. No matter what, it's going to be a shock to be like, oh my gosh, I'm out of my sheltered pot and into the garden. So we just want to minimize that. So this is just an idea of some, how some of these different seedlings will look. We have to look at those root systems. If they are at all starting to wind around, we have to loosen that. What I call fluff the root ball. Gently loosening those roots so that they will then grow out. If you've ever gotten, especially those little 6-pack annuals or things like that, and the roots are all wrapped around in a mass, at the end of the season, I bet when you remove those from the garden, they're in the same form. Those roots never took off. As critical as they are, the roots are stupid. They don't realize that they have all this new soil, and they will just continue in the same form. So we've got to loosen them to, let them know, hey, wake up. You have new soil to grow into. So layout. Changing from one season to another, if you have a large space for things that are, take some longer to fully mature, if you've got a big garden, it's real easy. This is March. They already have tomatoes planted here, well on their way to, taking off, but they've also got the tail end of the cool season, the onions, the cabbage that are still developing. So no biggie, not so much of a challenge if you have a big garden. But if you have a small garden, you need to be super strategic. And these guys did a great job. Onions, it takes them months. You plant onions in October. If you want a fully developed bulb onion, you won't harvest that until about May the next year. So we can't wait until May to plant our tomatoes. This is March. They are, look at how great big their tomatoes are already. But they kind of strategize so they'd have space to do that changeover, but leave the onions until they were fully mature. So always have to, be planning from one season to the next. And sometimes people ask me, well, how do I know when to harvest? Well, what do you pick at the market? You're gonna, pick out an eggplant that's pretty firm and it's glossy, shiny. You don't want an eggplant that's kind of, squishy or dull looking. That's past its prime. And definitely these yellow eggplants, those are ready to go into the compost. They're way past edible. A lot of our greens during the cool season, we can chop off the outer, older, lower leaves and leaving this growth here, that meristematic or growth center. It's going to just keep putting out new leaves, and we can keep chopping off the older ones. It keeps making new ones. So just keep on top of it. Usually regular harvest makes plants productive for a longer period of time. Now, I'm just going to take a few minutes. We're going to dive into this cool season. And then when we meet tomorrow, we'll finish up. I really want you to grasp kind of delineation of our seasons and what would be planted during those times. I think that's very important. Because boy, when I grew up, it was, the big party. Everybody planted their tomatoes Memorial Day weekend. So that's what I did here. And it was horrible. So you've got to understand the seasons. If you focus on your organic matter in the soil, proper watering, then knowing the seasons, you're all set. Now, cool season, and this is going to vary from year to year depending on conditions. It seems like our cool season is starting later every year, but overall, usually our cool season starts in October. There might be some things that you could plant even as early as September, but by around mid-October, when the temperatures start to decrease a little bit, soil starts to cool off just a little bit, until February or March. I'd say that's the main cool season that we're looking at. We grow during the cool season the leafy vegetables, our lettuce, our chard, our kale, things like that, spinach, root vegetables, those radishes, beets, not kohlrabi, turnips, things like that, rutabaga, flower buds. Can anybody name a flower bud that we eat? Broccoli, cauliflower, and I didn't know what category to put these in, and the peas. So these are the main things that we grow during our cool season. If you look for varieties that are quick to mature, you can do what we call successive planting, maybe about every 2 or 3 weeks, plant a little bit more. And then you can extend your harvest instead of having one major huge harvest of this type of or that type of vegetable all at once. Then you can just have a gradual harvest of these different varieties of vegetables throughout that season, which I think for most of us at home is the ideal thing. So if we are planting right now, we might need to try to cool the soil down. For our seed, some seed, it's so easy going, it doesn't matter what temperature it is, it's going to germinate. There are vegetables, however, that we must know the temperature of the soil, and if it isn't within the proper range, that seed's not going to germinate. It's like, nope, soil's too hot, I am not doing anything. So if that's the case, you might need to, spray the soil down to cool it and put shade over it to try to get that soil temperature lowered sufficiently to plant your cool season seed. So I'm going to get through a few of these and then we'll have questions. So for cool season, the peas. We have our shelling peas. There's so many wonderful different varieties. I would suggest that you give your peas support, and that way it's easier to harvest and they don't take as much space in the garden. The sugar peas, so many, I'm just, my mouth is watering thinking about fresh peas from the garden. But they're easy to grow, and you can eat, even the young leaves you can eat on your pea plants. Lettuce, there is so much lettuce. We have leaf lettuce and head lettuce. I am all for leaf lettuce because it's like that example I showed you. You can be harvesting the older leaves continually for a period of time. Head lettuce, you gotta wait till the head develops and harvest it all at once. But look at the beautiful shapes and textures and colors just with lettuce alone that are available. You can really make your vegetable garden a thing of beauty, an artwork. Look at these different colors of lettuce in here. Look at this. They really did like a tapestry. They were very careful in how they planted. It's just beautiful. So head lettuce, as I say, it needs to have a long period of time, long enough for that full head to develop before you harvest. But with the romaine and all these other leaf lettuces, we can gradually be harvesting the outer leaves and just let this midsection keep growing. Or, if we wanted a bigger romaine, like, might get in the market, you could leave it for a longer period of time and cut the entire plant at once. But I like that gradual cutting, then you don't have to worry about any of it going bad in the refrigerator. Now, pots. If you are going to grow vegetables in pots, you need to use a nice potting soil. Don't dig up soil from out in the yard, the garden. That can pose many different problems. And make sure the pot is big, unless it's the winter. You can get away with what I call cutesy pots, you know, those 6-inch wide pots. They won't do it for the summer though. But this is great. You know, they've just got all these little, you know, salad bowls basically with different varieties of lettuce growing, and they're, you know, next to the pool, getting that extra light there. Mezclin, these are meant to be cut when they're just, you know, a couple inches high, and you can usually get a few harvests off of one planting of your mesclun. It's very tender. You have some different robust flavors in a mesclun mix. And mustards, oh, nice tangy grains, can be eaten raw or maybe sauteed a little bit. But look at those colors and textures. And this is one of my favorites. It's so spicy, the Mizuna mustard. Very, very tangy. So I think we'll stop there. We'll pick up with the chart tomorrow evening. Do we have more questions?
Hi, Kirti. Yeah, we have a few questions. One is, where should I buy soil for my raised garden?
Okay. Now, if you have a raised planter, you know, pretty decent size, you might want to get soil in bulk. It would be much cheaper than purchasing bagged soil. And you could ask for, from say a rock yard, you could ask for a blend of sandy loam and compost. And you just have that dumped, and then you'll take it from probably your driveway where it's dumped to your gardening space. If it's a smaller planter or containers, then you could go the route of bagged potting soil. And there is gardening soil, bagged gardening soil. You could use that for, you know, planters. But as I say, it gets costly if you have to buy numerous bags.
Awesome. Thank you. And the next question is, would it be beneficial to add worms to my composting bin, or can I just do worm casings?
Now, worms really don't like our general compost bins because we're getting in there. We should be getting in there and mixing the materials regularly, and they don't like that very much. So, you know, that's different than doing worm composting, where you have an enclosure and, you know, they don't get tumbled and mixed like they do in just a regular compost system. So for your regular, you know, backyard composting, I'd say no, you don't want to use the worms. And I will mention that if you're doing the worm composting, generally we use red wigglers. They do not like the high summer temperatures. If you want to keep them going during the summer, you either need to, you know, bring them in, you know, put them in the, you know, the mud room or the laundry room, or, you know, something to keep them cooler. But they don't fare well if they're out in the yard when it's 115 degrees. They can't burrow down. Earthworms will just keep burrowing deeper into the soil as it gets hotter, and red wigglers can't do that.
And then the next question is, for raised flower beds, is hand watering the best? And since the probe is too large for raised beds, what is best to use to determine if soaked enough?
So for your raised beds, you can certainly use drip irrigation. It's very easy to, you know, guide your drip, your tubing up, whether it's brought up through via PVC up into that raised planter or using polytube. Either way, it's pretty easy to get that sent up to the top surface of your raised bed. and then have your poly tubing or spaghetti tubing deliver the water to your plants. So to me, that's overall the easiest and gives you more flexibility if you want to go away for a little while. Hand watering does have its limits, and sometimes ties us to our gardens. For some of us, that may be not a challenge at all, but for other people, it might be a little inconvenient. And getting somebody else to hand water your garden while you're gone, that's a challenge. Because a lot of times they don't have that investment, that passion for those plants that you do. And they tend to, maybe be somewhat forgotten until the day before you come home, and then the flood goes. I've heard that about, kids taking care of parents' gardens while they were out. Anyway, so you could do either way. You could hand water. And for a raised garden, you could use for vegetables. It could very well be that all you need is one of those long-stemmed screwdrivers. But I think if you have a yard at all, that investing in one of the 3-foot-long probes is ideal, because you can use that for checking the moisture in everything around your property.
Awesome, thank you. And then, let's see, what is the best way to store the seeds from our parent plants?
For most things, the most critical is having your seed properly matured and then dry. Store it in a cool, dry location.
And then the next question is, I've had so much trouble with my compost breaking down, not sure if it's too dry or missing a specific ingredient. I think she's just looking for suggestions.
Yeah, it is very, very important to keep your compost material consistently moist. If it does dry out, that certainly slows down the process of decomposition, slows it down to a crawl. So you want to keep it evenly moist. And there could be other factors. It might be that you don't have enough green or nitrogen material to fuel the microorganisms to break down the brown. There could be different factors, but certainly moisture is important.
Awesome. And then I believe this might be in one of the handouts that were in the attachment, or they can reference that calendar
Yes.
that was sent out in the emails for the handouts. But the question is, if I want to plant some cool season growers, do I start the seeds right now, or would I have had to start the seeds 6 weeks ago?
A lot of the things, it's ideal to start now, or you might even need to wait till we're a little cooler for some things. Other things, they're not as picky. For instance, you might have started chard, in September. So it really depends on the specific type of the vegetable, and that planting calendar can be very helpful in, kind of getting an idea of when you can start planting certain things. But remember, those are just guidelines. It fluctuates from year to year.
Sorry. And the next question is, I'm planning on planting sunflowers in February. Do I need to have them in a certain distance from any other seeds?
I would, it will depend on what type of sunflower it is. Some sunflowers get to be huge, 4 foot wide. Others are very narrow and upright. So just be aware of the mature size, especially that width, to help determine how far away it needs to be from other plants.
Sorry, there's a lot of questions. Let me. Next question is, how do I test soil for pH? Do I have to check pH for pots with potting soil?
You could, an easy way to get a rough idea of the pH You could use your little, standard pH testers, your little litmus paper. You can, some people have a pool and they've already got that on hand. Or in a lot of gardening centers, you can, purchase just a packet or a roll of the little testing strips. And that can give you a rough estimate of the pH. If you needed something very detailed, then you would have to go for a soil test.
Awesome. And it looks like this might be the last question. There might be another one that filters in, but what irrigation system do you prefer?
I do prefer having drip, and it's very easy. I'm very forgetful, so having a drip system that is connected to an automatic controller is, for me, ideal.
And then are the sprays for blossom end rot harmful to worms?
I honestly don't know. Blossom end rot is caused, I think, very frequently here in the desert by kind of erratic watering, letting the soil dry out too much, then you get it really wet, then it's dry, then it's really wet. Tomatoes really do need just a perfectly consistent moisture in the soil. So that inconsistent moisture can cause blossom end rot. And I think that's the case a lot of times here in the desert. But insufficient calcium. We have loads of calcium in our soil, but it's not always available for the roots to absorb because of the chemistry of our soil. I'm not sure what they would be spraying. To be honest, I'm really not aware of sprays for blossom end rot unless it is a calcium product. But overall, I don't think it would be harmful to earthworms.
Okay. And then looks like another one just came in. Is there any concerns with placing garden beds right up against house walls?
The consistent moisture, yes. That would not be good. You would want to have some kind of a really long-standing, permanent barrier, moisture barrier between your vegetable garden and the house structure. And you would also want to have something going perhaps under, the soil a little ways, a good 8 inches or, a foot even out from the house to make sure that the water doesn't, pool right next to the foundation.
Awesome.
So you can have a vegetable garden right up to the house, but you do need to take measures to make sure that that moisture won't hit the walls or be in, a lot of moisture in contact with the foundation.
Perfect, thank you. Looks like that might be all the I don't see any other questions coming in. So I think that might be it. I just want to thank you, KRT, for an awesome presentation. So we got part 1 completed today. We'll be back tomorrow at the same time, 6 o'clock, for the part 2. I just want to thank everyone for attending the workshop today. Here if you want to, do you mind going to the last slide, KRT, real quick?
Oh, yes. Oops.
There we go. Awesome. Thank you.
I forgot about that.
I almost did too. So here you'll see our contact information. You can also visit our city and town websites for additional resources and information.